But I would really love to welcome everybody to the Northern Ireland launch of the final report of the UK Women's Budget Group Commission on a Gender Equal Economy, named Creating a Caring Economy, a Call to Action. My name is Clare Bailey, and I'm very privileged to be the current chair of the Northern Ireland Assembly Women's Caucus. The Commission have been working across the past 18 months, and the caucus were due to meet with the Commission during their visit to Belfast last November as part of their evidence gathering session for the report. But unfortunately, we were unable to do that due to the timings in the run-up to the general election. So I'm really delighted to be hosting this launch today and to be discussing this report, more importantly, and its recommendations in specific relation to Northern Ireland. But before we begin, I'd really like to ask today's amazing lineup of speakers to just give us a quick introduction to who you are and where you're coming from, I suppose. It's not a quiz show, but yeah, over to our fabulous speakers, please. Lynn, we'll call on you first.
Okay, sorry. Good morning, everybody. My name is Lynn Carvill. I am convener of the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group, Chief Executive of Women's Tech, and I have been a commissioner on the Commission for a Gender Equal Economy. A massively brilliant experience.
Great. Rachel?
Thanks, Claire. So my name's Rachel Powell. I'm the Women's Sector Lobbyist with the Women's Resource and Development Agency, and I also chair and coordinate the Women's Policy Group for Northern Ireland.
Amazing, fabulous. Clare?
Hi everyone, I'm Clare Moore from the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. I'm delighted to be here this morning, and I'm also a member of both the Women's Policy Group and the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group.
Very welcome, and last but certainly not least, Liz?
Hello everybody, I'm Liz Law. I'm a member of the Northern Ireland Women's Budget Group, and I'm chair of the Northern Ireland Women's European Platform and a member of the committee of the UK Women's Budget Group.
Brilliant. Listen, thank you so much for being with us today. It's great to have you here, but also for the information for everybody who's tuning in. We're also on Twitter and of course have some hashtags for this event, but the report in general as well. And they are hashtag Caring Economy Now and hashtag WBG Commission. So please feel free to tweet early, tweet often, and let's make a bit of noise today about our report. So turning to the report then, this report lays out the roadmap to building a caring economy. It calls for radical societal transformation of how we view economy. And really it's a call to action at all levels and across the UK to design and demand a new economy where the well-being of individuals, communities and the planet are placed at the centre. It calls for an economy which values care work and critically acknowledges and recognises the value in both paid and unpaid care. It calls for an economy in which no one is left behind or pushed behind, because that is a caring economy. This report, Creating a Caring Economy, a call to action, comes at a crucial time. With the COVID-19 pandemic highlighting social and economic disparity, exposing and exploiting those inequalities that we know are already there. This report and its recommendations provide an opportunity to choose a necessary alternative to our current economic model. This pandemic has resulted in crisis at the national and the personal levels, but we can use this time as an opportunity to learn and reflect what people want to see, and that is an economy which puts people and planet first. A caring economy may be a radical proposal, but the principles on which it is based are well established. Most of all, it is also entirely achievable. It's tried and tested in other places, such as the Nordic countries like Finland, Norway, and Sweden. These countries adopt caring economies which centre people and nature as the top priorities, with significantly valuable and successful results. Good quality care services, such as adult social care and healthcare and childcare, are critical for a good economy, but a caring economy also extends beyond care services. It involves caring about the pay and conditions of workers. It involves acting together to end discrimination, deprivation, and poverty, and to eliminate violence and abuse. It involves caring about the planet on which we live together and creating sustainable green jobs. This caring economy encompasses gender equality, well-being, and sustainability. The COVID-19 pandemic has given us an insight into how a caring economy may be implemented, with solidarity among communities for those affected or those at high risk to infection, and in the way that air pollution levels drastically fell. Concurrently, it has shown the harsh realities of how our current economy is an uncaring one, where people with no buffer are left in hardship, with little to no recourse, with lack of personal protection equipment for health and social care workers, with lack of adequate financial support for those asked to quarantine or those who have lost their jobs, with low pay and poor condition for key and essential workers, and with the ways in which the home working has placed huge burdens on childcare responsibilities disproportionately experienced by women, causing detrimental impacts on their own well-being. Our present uncaring economy champions short-term financial interests and neglect of people and planet, instead of long-term investment for the benefit of all. There's really no better time than now for this call to action. I really want to thank the Women's Budget Group, the Commission on this Gender Equality Economy, for centering their report findings and recommendations for change, not only on the UK, but also specifically on our context here in Northern Ireland. The report is a really vital tool, and we can use this as a radical stimulus for how to enact this change. These are very wise and very practical steps, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. So without much ado, much more from me, I'd really like to hand over to Lynn and invite Lynn Carvill to present the Commission report and its recommendations for Northern Ireland. And there's no better woman. I'm delighted to have you, Lynn, and excited to listen to your talk here today.
Thank you. Thanks very, very much, Claire. Sorry. So there's a couple of things that need to happen here. One is technology and the other is, can I share a document? So let's see if this happens. Now, share my screen.
Great.
Yeah, it's all happening. Whoop, whoop.
We're getting good at this.
We really are. Okay, so everybody can see and hear me. Okay, so I will quickly, excuse me, run through maybe some of the history of where this report has come from and the genesis of the Commission. It seems a lot longer ago. It actually seems like maybe a couple of decades ago to where we are now. But the Commission itself launched last spring. Our first meeting was in London last April. There are 17 commissioners from all over England and the regions. We have from Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England. Coming from civil society organisations, academics, business, trades union and journalists, a real wide group of people. We met quite frequently and met across the regions as well. And many of you will remember when the Commission came to Belfast last November, where we heard from civil society organisations and women's sector organisations and equality and human rights groups, and also from some of our government officials on how things were going here in the devolved region of Northern Ireland. And I mean, I've said this on a number of occasions, but I think it's well worth repeating. The Commission have always said about how absolutely and totally impressed that they were with the input, and particularly from here, just in relation to, I think, the resilience of our sector and the women's sector in the face of so many different things that we are continually putting up with, never mind the pandemic, but maybe having no government and all sorts of different things. So it's worth repeating that. And we commissioned expert briefing papers, and to have that opportunity just for me personally was just quite amazing. Expert briefing papers on all sorts of things, pensions and social security and trade and care and paid care and unpaid care from experts all over the world really. So that was a fantastic opportunity. What really strengthened this work, it was twofold, and that was the Four Nations approach, lifting ourselves out of our local and to learn what's happening across Scotland and Wales and across the regions, and also the intersectional approach, which is very, very important, coming very much to the fore as we are facing this pandemic, knowing that people from different backgrounds experience poverty or health inequalities completely differently. So there's also very much an intersectional approach. This, if this works, which it should do, this was a video that was that I think is well worth sharing. That was produced in the midst of this work. But I think really it's what it's all about. It just very quickly tells people about the structural inequalities. And if I could just share this, and if somebody could let me know that they can hear it, they should be able to. But if you could, just watch this.
The COVID-19 crisis has exposed that the economy is not working. But for women, the economy has never really worked. Women do 60% more unpaid care and domestic work than men. So, women have less time for paid work, are more likely to work part-time, and be in precarious employment. Women are less able to travel for work, which restricts their job choices. Women earn less than men per hour and less overall. This means that they are more likely to be living in poverty and more likely to be poor in older age. They own less and save less than men. Because women earn less and have caring responsibilities, they rely more on benefits and public services like the NHS, and are hardest hit by cuts to benefits, tax credits and public services. Black, Asian and minority ethnic women and disabled women are hit hardest of all. Caring is seen as women's work, while earning money is seen as men's contribution to the family, which reinforces gender stereotypes about the interests and roles of women and men in society. So, paid care work is seen as something that women do naturally, and the skills involved are not recognised. As a result, paid care work is low status and badly paid. Employers make assumptions about women's abilities and likely behaviours. So, women face discrimination in the workplace, and their careers progress at a slower rate than men's because they spend more time caring. And this is reflected in the gender pay gap. Women have less time to take part in politics and public life, meaning that women are underrepresented in decision-making positions. As a result, policies and laws are more likely to be based on men's needs. Inequalities based on gender intersect with other forms of inequality based on race, disability, class, age, sexuality, and other identities. This means that inequality takes different forms and can be more severe for some women than others. Widespread violence against women and girls is a cause and consequence of women's economic inequality and poverty. Poverty makes it harder to leave an abusive partner, while abuse limits women's economic opportunities. So, how do we break this cycle? In order to create an economy that works for everyone, we need to challenge and dismantle structural inequalities. This means recognising and valuing care for what it is, a central part of life. We will all require care at some point in our lives. And ensuring a fairer distribution of unpaid care between women and men. The Commission on a Gender Equal Economy is developing alternative economic policies to promote gender equality in the UK, because it doesn't have to be like this. We can do things differently.
I think that animation probably much more succinctly and ably articulates the why this work has happened more than I ever could. And I think, while in some ways that is, it's the problems and the structural inequalities that we face, the report is actually very positive and looking positively at what we can do to tackle and challenge these inequalities and work towards what is a caring economy. And as Clare has already mentioned, it is gender equality, and where gender equality, sustainability and well-being all intersect. So in the report, you will see that there are 8 steps, and I'm not going to go into these in any great depth, but I would urge you to read the report and the summary that's available. And the first step is about re-envisioning what we mean by the economy, and it's not just about measuring growth and GDP and productivity, because we need to value things that are beyond what we put market value on, and that's the first point. And secondly, it's about investing in social and physical infrastructure. And again, at the beginning of this work, we didn't have a pandemic and we didn't have COVID. So things were thrown into sharp relief, I think, when that happened. And we can see the need to invest in childcare and in our health services much, much more now than what we did even 18 months ago. And then it's about transforming the worlds of paid and unpaid work. Because you will see in the report how paid work is mostly seen as, the man is still seen as the breadwinner, whereas stereotypically women undertake the unpaid work, which that means that they don't have the time that maybe to do the paid work that they would like to. But this is important for everybody, that this is transformed. And then it's about investing in a caring social security system, a proper safety net, that if we come across any bumps in the road, that there is something there to catch us. And there are more holes in that, as we all know, as time moves on. So it's not the safety net that it was. And then it's about transforming the tax systems across the UK. We have a very regressive tax system, and we need to make it more progressive. It's about refocusing fiscal and monetary policy on building a caring economy and embedding gender equality in that. And this is all eminently doable. And it's working to develop a trade system that is socially and environmentally sustainable. And again, this is very, very important in terms of the current Brexit trade deals or trade talks and the negotiations that are happening at the moment. And then it's about working to transform the international economic system as well. And all of these are very, very clearly and accessibly laid out in the report. So finally, I would say that some of these things might seem very, very difficult to pursue or so big to progress at this stage, but there is progress underway. And governments have adopted a wellbeing approach in terms of their economic policy in a number of countries, in New Zealand, Iceland, and Scotland and Wales. And maybe it's something that our government could think about here. We have an innovative green social housing project such as Goldsmith Street in Norwich. And one of my learnings, I've learned so much as I was undertaking this work, was about what green means and what sustainability means and what green jobs mean. And green jobs are not just about recycling and cleaner energy. Green jobs are about health and education. So it's much broader than what my understanding was. And then there's Danish investment in care, where care workers are paid similarly to teachers. And in the private sector, the company Aviva have a policy where they offer equal parental leave to both parents. And I think that's very important, and again something that more companies could do and everybody should be doing. And in Scotland, where they have devolved social security rules similar to Northern Ireland, but they have used them and have increased by 13% their carers allowance, and plus have additional payments during COVID-19. So all of this is doable, and there are good examples of what has happened. So I'm going to leave it there. I hope that the video was able to articulate much more than what I could, and I'm going to pass it back to Clare. Thanks very much, everybody.
Lynn, thank you so much. And I just want to really reiterate to everyone listening that this report is so accessible. It is so straightforward. And please, if you haven't already, do give it a read. There's really exciting and, as you say, imminently doable recommendations in there as well. And that's the key question I think that you raised there as well. You know, have a think about what do we mean when we say the economy. You know, these are constructed notions, and if they've been constructed, they can be reconstructed, you know, so no better time. But yes, I would like to bring in the rest of the panelists, and we're going to move into a bit of a Q&A at the minute. We're going to just have a bit of time with our panelists, about 10 minutes allocated for each question, and after which I hope to have a bit of time as well for any other questions or comments coming from our audience as well. So just for everybody listening in, if you want to submit your questions or comments, if you could please put them into the Q&A box rather than the chat box. The chat box, sometimes things get lost with the feed coming through, but please do feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box, because in this new normal, when we can't be physically present in the room and see who's here, just that's where we can have our chatter and keep conversations and introductions and strengthening networks going as well. So Q&As into the Q&A box and keep the chatter going and in the chat box, and we'll see all of that. So I suppose my first question that I would like to be putting out is just to ask the panelists, and maybe Rachel, Liz and Claire to give Lynn a wee break there, but how do you feel, how does this work really build upon existing activism for gender equality and well-being in Northern Ireland? We know that there's a lot going on, but how does this report build on that? And I maybe bring in Rachel first. We'll have about 10 minutes to hopefully try and get a few answers in from our speakers.
Thank you, Claire. So from our perspective in the women's sector in Northern Ireland, this work builds on and completely complements the work that we're already doing. So I know a number of us met with the Commission last year as a broad group of the women's sector and highlighted that many of the concerns raised by the Commission and the UK Women's Budget Group are in fact worse in Northern Ireland when you break down the statistics. So for example, we're the only area in the UK and Ireland without any childcare provision at all. And that has been activism that's been ongoing for 30 years to try and get a provision or even a strategy in place. When we look at the health and social care sector, there are about 70% women in the rest of the UK. In Northern Ireland, it's 79% women, particularly women in the privatised care sector in low paid precarious work. When we look at lone parents, the group most subject to poverty, it's 91% women in Northern Ireland. And again, then looking at the disabled population, as a legacy of the conflict, our disabled population is much higher than the rest of the UK. When we look at carers, again, disproportionately women, but in Northern Ireland, they tend to leave the workforce about 11 years sooner than men. And that was before COVID hit. We know there's been over a 20% increase in people taking on unpaid care for their families. And I also know research from Carers NI shows that unpaid carers create the value of about 4.6 billion worth of caring for Northern Ireland alone. So it just shows that, women in these roles are really holding up our economy. So on top of this, when we look at the Northern Ireland perspective and years of political instability, this year alone, I know it seems like it was almost a decade ago at this stage, but back in January when we just got the executive up and running again and had 3 years worth of work to catch up on, COVID hit immediately. So it made it incredibly difficult to be able to make any progress as COVID took the priority. And just to really, I wanted to talk about some work that has been happening specifically from the Women's Policy Group. And we have a lot of shared membership with the Women's Budget Group as well, but through the Feminist Recovery Plan that we recently created that completely complements the Commission's report. So for those that don't know, the Women's Policy Group, similar to the Women's Budget Group, is a group of women working in policy roles across Northern Ireland. And it's not just from the women's sector, it's LGBT, trade unions, human rights, migrant rights, feminist and advocacy roles, a whole range of different groups are involved. And we tend to do policy work and respond to any new consultations, calls for evidence, any potential legislation. But I think it's worth noting you can't remove policy from the economy, and they're both so interlinked, which is why this work does complement each other so well. But for us, we were immediately concerned about the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on women globally. And we worked significantly on this at the very beginning of the pandemic. We produced briefings, articles, different statements. We submitted evidence to both the NI executive and the Westminster Women and Inequalities Committee. And as the months went on, we just found that, we were getting an acknowledgement, yep, okay, it's much worse for women, but we weren't seeing anything happen as a result of that. And I think that's why it's useful for us to work on a UK-wide level, because some of the issues are for Westminster and need Westminster intervention, but we also need our sisters in the UK to be aware of the Northern Ireland specific concerns. So we know that across the world, this pandemic created an unprecedented challenge and particularly put a sharp focus on the importance of care work, both paid and unpaid. And we already were able to see that women were bearing a particular brunt to this crisis, economically, socially, and in terms of health. And interestingly, Northern Ireland is one of the only areas in the world where more women had died from COVID as well. So we need to look at why this is the case. But the Women's Policy Group work and activism that's been ongoing, and the broader women's sector and women's budget group, have been calling for a gender-sensitive crisis response as we transition from crisis to recovery. And I suppose you could say we're back into crisis now. But we really wanted an acknowledgement from our elected officials to state that men and women experience the crisis differently. And for women, the issues of inequality that existed before the pandemic had now been exacerbated. And back in December 2019, we had created a women's manifesto looking at different areas of where we needed change to happen. And many of the issues of our feminist recovery plan and the Commission's report are the same issues that existed before COVID, and they've just been worsened. So we did see some small gains, for example, women who were losing their maternity pay because they were being furloughed. We did see changes on that, but very little was happening in relation to women. So that's when we decided to create our feminist recovery plan, a 127-page document with an economic justice pillar, health, social justice, equality, looking at the implications of Brexit, and also international best practice. But another area.
We'll maybe come back to that. I'm just conscious of time here and trying to bring in the other speakers as well. I have a few more questions to go, but maybe Liz, if you want to come in there as well, and maybe looking at that question and how is it that we can use this report to build on the existing activism that's going on within your sphere as well?
Well, really, Rachel's done a great job there as to what has happened. But just to echo what Lynn was saying about when the Commission visited Belfast, I wasn't able to be there either, and I heard that message, that how impressed people were just about how horrified they were and dismayed they were about the challenges that women were facing, but also how impressed they were by the work that's being done. And I think that that's been further evidenced in terms of the whole pivoting that the women's sector has done since COVID in order to turn work around and to do two things: to carry on the good work that was being done with women, and also to look at the solutions and to prepare the feminist recovery plan. So that's all been seen in that. And then that's against, I see a comment in the chat box about how precarious the support for the community multi-sector is. And I think that's just the picture of where we are, and so there's that energy to provide these solutions, and there's the ability to get on and to do it. But there needs to be the engagement and across the board with the decision makers and policy makers taking it forward.
Brilliant, thank you. And Clare, this is in no particular order, it's just the order it's on my screen. So, but yeah, so for where you are with the trade unions, I mean, you've got a huge access there as well. But how do you feel then that this work could be, used to build on existing activism?
Thanks very much, Claire, and again agreeing with everything that Rachel, Liz and Lynn has said, and congrats to the Commission for this report, and Lynn in particular for representing us so well. I think one of the things I want to say is that I think this report, the work that the Women's Policy Group has been doing, the Women's Budget Group, the trade union movement,
really re-emphasizes this whole myth about austerity. I think we've been told for the last, 10, 12, 15 years that austerity is inevitable, that there's no alternative to austerity, there is no alternative to caps in public pay, to low pay in the private sector, all of that. What we know and what has been further emphasized over the last 6 months is that austerity is ideologically driven, because we've seen with COVID, we've seen the massive investment. Okay, it's not been enough. Some of the job retention schemes we've been very critical of, but we've seen the fact that the government has stepped in, a Tory government has stepped in, and there's been massive state intervention. And we've seen that that's not only entirely possible, but it's also been necessary. So I think that's something that this report and the work that we've all been doing really exposes and clarifies in a very clear way. And just just to say very quickly, Clare, that the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, which represents some 800,000 members across this island, has produced a report called No Going Back, and which is basically, again, a call to action around the policies and proposals that we believe need to be taken to achieve a just and equal society. And many of the proposals within that report also chime very clearly with the Commission's report. So I think there's a great degree of activism ongoing that we can build on.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And just maybe give you a bit of time before I come back to you then. But if you have access to that report, it might be worth posting a link up in the chat box there for people to have a look at as well. But I was struck by Rachel and her comments. She really did pointed out the difference between, Northern Ireland powers and devolved powers and reserved matters. And when we're looking at the specific measures and recommendations in this report that are tailored for Northern Ireland, I suppose my next question, I'm going to bring Lynn back in with this one as well, is what is the Northern Ireland Executive's role in delivering the devolved recommendations within here, but also for keeping up the pressure for change in reserved matters and policy over at Westminster as well. And maybe go to you first then, Liz. Or sorry, Lynn.
That's a hard question, Clare. Clearly, our government has a role, because everybody now has raised certain issues. Like, I'm interested in, Clare has said about austerity, completely knocked out of the water. The work around intersectionality and all the issues that Rachel has covered and covers in the report. It just really strikes me that how you couldn't do anything at this stage is the issue. How you actually couldn't do anything. So in March, which is not that long ago, and I know it feels a long time ago, and we're all kind of, reeling, I think, from this too. In March, our schools closed at the end of March. We were all working, next thing the schools closed. And the moment that happened, the economy closed, because we do not have childcare, because kids were sent home to their parents, and everybody pivoted around to working from home. It was like everything we have been talking about in terms of policy and theory, that everything we know was just properly illustrated in our face. And then we had all our care workers, and we had our health professionals who were actually taking their lives in their hands every day in our hospitals and care settings. And we had our shelf stackers, and we had, do you remember the week when the bins weren't collected and everybody was going up the walls? All these really practical, really important things that actually to our survival were critical. And Anne Pettifer, I was at a different seminar a few weeks ago, and she spoke about, it was very clear that the oligarchs and the overpaid footballers, they don't matter to our society. It was all those other people that matter. So this was in our face, in our where we live in Northern Ireland, and then the people come out and the volunteers come out and they fed our elderly and they fed our vulnerable, and I was so proud of people. I just couldn't believe it. So we saw the really good things and we saw everything was laid bare. So how can we ignore this? And how can our assembly ignore this? And how can our executive ignore this? So it's there to see. We have no school at the moment. People are again working from home. So, so we were talking earlier this morning, I was talking to our colleague about, you know, when people are working from home and trying to be all professional and a kid flies past the back, you go, mommy, mommy, or daddy, daddy, whatever, you know. So that's what we're working with now. So my question is not what we can do, it's why, how can anybody ignore that this is the case? I mean, a childcare strategy should be on the table. It should be there now. It should be done and dusted, as should, I have to say, instead of clapping for our carers, that we actually start paying people and actually valuing care. And I have to say my perspective has changed somewhat in this, because I wanted macroeconomics to be discussed and budgetary processes and stuff, but I am now like going, do you know what? It's about care, and care is radical, and that's what it's about. So we need to do something.
Excellent. I think yeah, I mean, it was just so stark and so immediate, and the focus changed. So while some of us have known this for quite a long time, the reports have been out there, the studies have been done, the information and evidence is sitting there, you know, we could never have expected to see such an immediate wide societal reaction as we got when the lockdown hit, which is phenomenal. Liz, have you any ideas? I know that you also work at a European level too, but just even, you know, looking at our own levels of decision makers and policy and governance, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, and I think you set out all the actors, and the key thing is to see how we get all of government working well, and how we get, you know, an evidence-based policy making process out of right across the board. And, you know, I was trying to think, you know, have we done it? You know, is there an example? And the example that came into my mind was the work done by women in relation to welfare reform, the Empty Purse campaign. And if people don't know about the Empty Purse campaign, it's in the Women's Budget Group casebook on gender budgeting. But it was a campaign looking at the issues in welfare reform, and crucially engaged with the minister and with the Assembly Scrutiny Committee, and, you know, actually that message, the voice of women, was heard, and there were key flexibilities created as defaults in terms of fortnightly payments and split payments. May seem small in this span of welfare reform, but it was very significant, and it was actually somewhere where Northern Ireland led the way, because that voice had been listened to. It was without cost, so it wasn't about more money, it was about how money is being spent better, you know, and what are the issues around it. However, when that came to be operationalised, there were systemic difficulties, there were issues in the training for officials, weren't trained, the information materials weren't prepared with those two measures as a default. So the lesson was, well, you needed that voice to be heard right at the beginning, and that evidence-based policy making right from the beginning, including at Westminster when that was begun. And, you know, those flexibilities are now being adopted across the UK. But, you know, a real message, you need to take account of this at the earliest stage. So in terms of the lessons from the Commission around the care economy, the Women's European Platform had a series of webinars, and in the very first one, when we were listening to women's voices, it was very clear that it was the care economy that all the others needed to be based on. So it's about getting that clear message around the effective evidence-based policy making. It has to be across the board, and the report shows that you can't just fix a wee bit and fitter about. You really have to take a transformational approach.
Great, evidence-based policy making and decision making. It's absolutely key. Claire, do you want to come in on that one?
I do, thanks very much. Yeah, just to make a couple of quick points. I think the first one is about civic engagement and social dialogue. And I think it's important to say that in all other Western European countries, there are well-established mechanisms for social dialogue and engagement where key stakeholders, the trade union movement and other key stakeholders engage with government and policy makers on social and economic matters. And this is something that we've been calling for many, many years in Northern Ireland. And I think that's something that the executive can act upon very easily and would make social and economic policy meaningful. But I also want to remind us all that the Northern Ireland Assembly has competence on employment rights. And many of the matters that are discussed in the Commission's report around rights to flexible working, rights to parental leave is something that the Assembly can also look at and consider. Progressive rights in relation to the promotion of collective bargaining and sectoral bargaining. The Commission's report makes very clear that being a member of a trade union leads to better pay and terms and conditions. So I think it's something that the Northern Ireland Assembly needs to consider and has competence to consider, most importantly. And the last point very quickly to make, Clare, is around data and the requirement for better, and in some places better gender disaggregated data. In some cases it's not collected at all. For instance, I went to look for the number of women who've been made redundant since the start of the pandemic, and I talked to some economist colleagues and was told that that data was not available for Northern Ireland. So, I mean, we really need to get to grips with, and this is something that the women's sector and others have been calling for many, many years. So that's
So you've went on mute. No, that's great. That's actually stark. Is in Northern Ireland, what data is it that we are collecting? What is it that we're fixated on? And is that fit for us moving into the future? Is that the information that we need, I suppose, to target? But you also brought up civic engagement and social dialogue there. So I'm going to take that as maybe a wee reminder to let our listeners know to stick your Q&As into the Q&A box. We will come to them very, very shortly and start having your inclusion here as well. But Rachel, have you anything to add in terms of that governance system and keeping up the pressure for change, as well, both local and Westminster or whatever level?
Yeah, so I think at a local perspective, we need for our politicians to stop taking a gender neutral approach to all policy making. A lot of the time legislation, it's almost like they're afraid to even say the word women. New decade, new approach, no mention of women at all. When the 5 steps to reopening the economy was announced, there was no mention of childcare, which was going to prevent many women even getting to step 1 of reopening the economy. And we need to actively ask at a Northern Ireland level and a UK-wide level for each and every policy and budgetary decision to be assessed on the impact on gender. And looking at welfare reform, this is one of those examples of something that was created at Westminster level, but then became devolved. And we know that 86% of tax revenue savings came from women. How would a form of legislation like that get passed? Because they didn't look at how it would impact women. And there's this mentality in Northern Ireland, and we see it with our Section 75 screening that, oh, well, this cut impacts everyone, so it can't be disproportionate on women, without acknowledging that women rely on public services at a much higher level. And even whenever the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights did his report into the UK, he described welfare reform as one of the most misogynistic policies he had ever come across. And that was before COVID, and we know poverty is going to worsen. And we need to look at the decisions that are happening at a Westminster level and see what we can do differently in Northern Ireland, because it's not good enough to say, oh, well, this was decided by Westminster, or we don't have the money from the Barnett consequential, that was decided by Westminster too. We should be having some creative economic thinking in Northern Ireland, and we need to stop dismissing women's issues as being something that is a part of private family life. Care is a public good, and we need to look beyond the Department for Communities. We need every single department to see this as their issue too. It's a green issue. Putting care at the middle of Green New Deal would make a huge transformation in our society. It's an economic issue, an infrastructure issue. It really impacts every single department, and we need a department-wide, we need the whole executive to take ownership over gender equality, and we need to start delivering for women in Northern Ireland.
Brilliant. That's fighting talk coming there.
Always there.
But I suppose I've just last question before we start moving into the Q&A. So for me, I'm hearing a lot of similar conversations. So we see a lot of organizations, a lot of sort of grassroots networks. They're all coming up with notions and different titles on them in terms of, rebuilding economies, or how we build back better, or Green New Deal. And we know that we've got this triple crisis going on at the minute. So we've got COVID and the health crisis and the pandemic, and then the economic crisis that is bringing with it. And the climate crisis, which is going to be the superseding one that we haven't even begun to really tackle yet. And then we've got Brexit as the cherry on the top. So there are just so many huge structural and societal issues going on out there that is creating so much change, and those conversations are happening. Maybe my last question to all of you is really, how do we build support for these proposals? How do we generate the platform to move these conversations from something happening at the grassroots level into maybe a more empowering or more cohesive or more powerful place? How do we build that support to generate actual change here in Northern Ireland? And I'm going to give that one over to Clare first, because I'm conscious I haven't brought you in first. Sorry to throw it at you, but I think it's a really important one.
It is a really important one, Clare, and I think events like this are, very much part of that conversation and part of the work that we need to do. And I think engagement with, for example, the Northern Ireland Women's Caucus, and looking to see what what the caucus and you as the chair can do to promote this work in particular, the Commission's report, but also all of the work, the Feminist Recovery Plan, the work that the trade unions are doing, all the work that us as campaigners, as activists are doing on the ground. So I think, it would be very interesting to hear your thoughts on that, as well as to how we can push that from a legislator's point of view. And I think the other thing that springs to mind is that at the moment, the Department for Communities is just beginning to develop the strategic equality strategies, which we've been waiting on for a very long time. So gender, disability, anti-poverty, sexual orientation. And I think it's very important that, I think Rachel mentioned it earlier on, that this is taken as, if you like, a whole deep government perspective, that those equality strategies are not just communities. It's about involving the Department for the Economy, it's about involving infrastructure, because we know that all of those policies around how towns and cities are built are all gendered. So we need to look at all of those issues, we need to look at them together. And when we're doing that work around those strategic equality strategies, we need to make sure that the excellent work that is being done by all of us is incorporated and taken into consideration.
Brilliant, thank you. And next on my sightline list then, I'm going to go to Liz.
Well, you just to take up, and heartily agree with what Clare has said and Rachel before her about, right, where does it go indeed, and it does have to be a transformative approach and recognise the imperative that we see. So the women's voices showed that. There's the political will then to put that in the programme for government, and yes, we welcome the gender strategy and the social strategies as a a fine lens, but it needs to be there in the programme for government. It needs to be what the programme for government is for and is about. Mary Robinson was asked last week at a conference on women, peace and security about gender budgeting, and when she said you need the data, you need to do the gendered analysis, and essentially she was saying you can't afford not to. And I think that's what we've seen in terms of the falling out of austerity, and then what's happened in COVID, and then the lack of women's parity in the decision making, and finding the next steps and problem solving out of that. And it's even more important in this new environment where there's more pressure on resources and greater stress, that we have to do things well and we have to do things better. And as you said earlier, Claire, we can learn from others. There are examples on these islands in terms of in Scotland where, an equality analysis is actually built in to the budget process, and in Wales as well with their wellbeing government, their feminist government, how they've done that, and in the south they've got equality budgeting as part of their programme for government. And then if we go a bit further, well, maybe not sunnier than today, New Zealand and their wellbeing government, which shows that it's not a zero-sum argument. This is actually improving society, and it's making it better for everybody, and it's essential for everybody to be able to flourish and to be safe and secure. Canada as well, more examples, and with their Gender Plus system, which actually takes in, specifically looks at that intersectionality that we were looking at, and looks at women and men and their life experience in different communities, urban, rural, disabled women and men, so on, and actually looking at what people's experience is, hearing that and putting that at the heart of your decision making. And the Commission report has shown how that can be done and how it's right across the board, but crucially how important it is to ensure that women are at the heart of that rebuilding, whatever we call it.
Brilliant. I'm furiously writing notes here. This is great. But Rachel, back over to you then.
Yeah, so I think this is a really tricky one, and it's one where it just shows the culture that we have in Northern Ireland. Women's issues are for women to worry about when they should be for everyone to worry about. Investing in care, and we look at childcare, unpaid care as examples. Yes, women are disproportionately impacted by this, but if we were to invest in these, it benefits everyone, and we need to stop siloing issues where women are worse impacted as only being issues for women, and we need to gain greater support on this. And I think in the Northern Ireland context, we need to look at the fact as well that we are a post-conflict society, and so many studies show that countries that don't have gender equality are less likely to have sustainable peace. And look at how fragile our systems are in Northern Ireland. And I do think that women's participation in decision making needs to be at the core for us to be able to build support for these issues. So I noticed one of the comments was about Brexit as well. Where are women involved in decision making around Brexit? They aren't, and it's one of the issues that is likely to create the biggest political instability and really threaten our peace process the most out of what I can see since the Good Friday Agreement. So to me, I think we need to look at it as not just a woman's issue. Look at why it's not being supported at the minute. Where are the women? I think we need to look at not only public bodies, but we need to look at our private sector too. How do they benefit from putting care at the core and trying to achieve gender equality? Because it's all well and good having our government being in support of these issues, which I couldn't say we have that fully yet, but if we do, I think we need to look at our private sector. What are they doing to tackle a gender pay gap, flexi working, parental leave? How does it benefit their organizations as well and our wider society? And just for me to finish as well, I think looking at our economic decision making at present, so the Conservative government and the austerity driven economic models that they create, they're based on historic economic theories developed by men who made these theories on the assumption that women stayed at home and that the economy was held up by women and their unpaid labor. And we need to actually create economic models that reflect our society now and the realities that we live in. You know, women aren't just at home holding up our economy, they're active citizens, and we need to start making policies that actually reflects that.
Great. Listen, thank you. And I know that we're pushed for time here, so maybe come to Lynn for a quick roundup before we go for a Q&A and see what the questions from the audience are.
Okay, well, I'll be very brief. And just in terms of about building support for this, and I had some slides in the presentation because polling has taken place, you know, as well around some of these issues. Around, you know, do we value care? Would we pay more for care? Would we pay more tax? And people will do it. So it's not, I mean, we're asking for these things as, you know, this is our job. This is, you know, there's a women's movement, there's a trade union movement, but actually citizens and people across this country, society are saying, we want change. And that's what I just want to come back to what I said at the beginning. You know, it's in our face now. We can't not say it. You know, in terms of the need for childcare and the need to value our health workers and our public sector workers and our retail workers and the people who are literally keeping us alive. So people do want it. But then the other side of that is the political will and people turning their, you know, this is you, Clare, then, you know, turning your, you know, you're concentrating your efforts on those things that actually matter and creating that caring economy. I think that's important.
Great. And I suppose turning on us, we are the Women's Caucus, I suppose, but just to let you know and make sure that everybody knows, and I know that there are a few of our caucus members from the chat room here that I can see are tuned in with us today as well. But the caucus are really committed to and embedded, are really committed to gender budgeting and doing what we can to begin to try and embed this through not just the Assembly, but executive decision making. And seeing how we can move forward on that one. And you're absolutely right. I think it was Rachel pointed out, you know, women's issues are everybody's issues, you know, and let's stop siloing. We're used to this silo mentality, and maybe try and give you a commitment today that we don't have the structure in place yet, but if we do, that I would be happy if the Women's Caucus are ever to be able to bring motions for debate. That if that happens under, you know, the time that I am still chair, give you a commitment that I would be very, very privileged to bring this report forward with the permission and agreement with the other caucus members for debate in the Assembly and to try and generate and stimulate that discussion. And I think that there are a few other channels out there that we're looking at the minute. Certainly I am, in how do we move this civic conversation into new levels, you know, and how do we completely tie that in with government and decision makers, and how do we make sure that it is structured, that it is focused, and that it has an outcome. So I promise you those conversations are happening, and doing what we can there as well to link up wider society with the decision makers, but not just for tick box exercises, you know, with new ways of being. So I'll maybe look at the Q&A. We have questions coming in here, and one from Angela, who's asking, does creating a caring economy also include the voluntary and community sector? They have to wait year on year funding, which is a huge issue, and funding in many cases can be only 75%, and therefore further funding has to be funded to ensure an appropriate salary. This means that community project workers are often doing 1.5 roles for one salary. Been there, Angela? Exactly. This needs to change as the sector is experiencing extreme burnout and needs help now. Maybe go to Liz maybe on that one, if that's okay.
Well, yeah, like I was saying earlier, you know, that whole, you know, the absence of resource, and I don't want to leap ahead, but Brexit was mentioned as well, but, you know, we need to remember where we were before COVID as well, and not be taken over by you know, sort of the things that have to change because of COVID. You know, there were things beforehand, and one of the things was the lack of consolidation of the work that was being done, and that is essential. You know, that we actually look across the board and make sure that that's secured, and for a way forward, that it means that there's true participation in it all.
sense of security. Liz, I'm going to throw you, or sorry, Lynn, I'm going to throw you in there again as well. I know that you're very well connected and long term within the sector as well. But I think that issue of having to wait for and that continuation of year-on-year funding, so it's nearly like people in the sector have to apply for their own salary for the next year, which is always problematic too. The lack of security, but the completely valuable and essential work that they do.
Yeah,
in the community.
25 years, Claire, 25 years been in the sector. It's a long time, and this has been a special year. I've put some thought into this as well this year, and we're up. It's up there with way back in March, which that was D-Day for many of us. When our society literally closed down, schools closed, everything closed. Within a couple of days, it was the community and voluntary sector who were out feeding people. I mean, because I work for a women's organisation and I had to think this through, it was very difficult for us to go out and do something, but we realised that somebody said to me, because women and older people had to shield and women had to care. So it was difficult for anybody with those kind of responsibilities to do anything. But I was so proud of our sector. So and it's not a reflection on anybody, but while public sector workers were furloughed, the community and voluntary sector were out making sure that those who are the most vulnerable in our society were actually okay or were being fed and looked after. And I mean, I think, again, how can you not see this? So you can't unsee what you've seen. And it was immediate. And that, it's in your face. We can meet emerging needs. It is disgraceful the way we're treated, but the power relationships aren't equal. So the people who fund us just have different power than what we have. But I think we should be proud of what happened this year. I really do. And I think that we should continue to advocate that our work is valued more. I think we need a Social Value Act, and I think we need more long-term funding. So for Angela, I completely agree with everything she says, but I think we should be singing from the highest mountains about how we met the crisis with immediacy and with effect as well.
Brilliant and absolutely spot on. That's another one. Just let's get stuck in there. This year has been the game changer. But we have a final question in the box there, and I'll maybe throw it out then to Clare and Rachel, and it's from Emma Sheeran. And Emma is asking, these are two great questions, by the way, but Emma has this question: given that so many of our workers' rights, including parental leave, equality of pay, are grounded in EU law, how worried are you about the disproportionate impact of Brexit on women here? Fantastic question. Over to you, Rachel.
Yeah, so Emma, I posted a link into the chat as well about something that we did. It was actually last year at this stage about Brexit and the impact on women, and we're extremely worried about this because, as you said, many of women's, particularly economic and social rights, have come through the EU. Again, in the international human rights framework, they're always considered more of the soft human rights because they're the ones that disproportionately impact women. But I am extremely worried because I have absolutely zero faith in the UK government to care at all about Northern Ireland, never mind women in Northern Ireland. And I'm really worried as well about any repeal or scrapping of the Human Rights Act. And as we're going to be leaving, the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which only having it and the European Convention does it actually have its strength. I'm extremely worried about the impact overall and the ability to overturn existing law at a UK level. So for us, we're extremely concerned as well about not only the rights that we could lose, but what we're going to miss out on. And something big that's happening in the EU now is recognising carers as economic citizens to give them the same rights as other workers in travelling across the EU. And that's something that we won't see here. And I think what's most important about this is it really shows the need for a Northern Ireland Bill of Rights. We need a Northern Ireland specific Bill of Rights to protect the rights that we've already fought to get, and to also enhance our rights further. So women are going to be disproportionately impacted. Like, I'm from South Armagh, and it's an area that is extremely worried about what's going to happen on the border. And women have not been involved at all in the negotiation process for Northern Ireland, and we've had no voice on this. So we urgently need to put Brexit at the front of everyone's head again and really hold the UK government to account, because what they're doing right now is a complete disgrace.
Down to the 1st of January, absolutely. And brilliant to hear the Bill of Rights being brought back into conversations as well. We need to be really strong on that one and not letting it go. Clare, just to wrap up then.
Yeah, Yeah, just very briefly, agree with everything that Rachel has said. I mean, we've said very clearly that the UK government's attitude in relation to Brexit is absolutely reckless. And we issued a statement in the last couple of weeks with our counterparts in Scotland and Wales, condemning the attitude of the UK government in relation to Brexit. And I think absolutely pointing to what we have, but also what is coming down the track in relation to the European Union, because there's discussion, for instance, at the moment about gender pay transparency directive within the EU. And Ursula von der Leyen has made a commitment. I mean, the commitment's been pushed a little bit, but she's made a commitment that that directive will be coming in. So I think this is something that is really, really concerning for all of us, and the impact on all citizens and women in particular is very, very worrying.
Yeah, absolutely. But isn't it, I'm very aware that we've run over a wee bit. We started a little late, and thank you so much to everybody tuning in for your time. But I really want to say thank you to everybody who has contributed to making today happen. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you for your time, to Lynn, Rachel, Clare and Liz. But a huge big thank you also to the UK Women's Budget Group and the Commission on Gender Equality Economy, and the work that they've done to produce this really a targeted report. Thank you, and not least of all to Marion Staples, who is the report author as well. It's a fantastic job. And to thank you to everybody who's put the links to many more reports as well into the chat there today. And I hope that everybody's been able to access those, and please hang on to them and use them freely and share them among your own networks. I think that this is the beginning of a really good conversation. I think that the time that we have now is not going to be had again. So let's use it to be that call to action. But thank you so much to everybody who's joined us today and who've engaged with the work of the Commission. I'm really energized by what we've heard and what we've discussed today, and hope that it is just the start of making absolutely long overdue and essential change to a better and more sustainable future. Thank you everybody for being here today, and thank you to the Commission. Cheers.
Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Clare.